Hello and welcome to our first topic within our first chapter of IB Biology. Today is all about cells, a pretty incredible little piece of biology, but we are going to dive into quite a bit of topics within this small set of notes. This is our first subunit within the entire chapter, so it does cover quite a bit of stuff. We will focus more on all of these things in class, but I just sort of want to give you like a good overview of where we're heading. So let's dive right in with the functions of life. What are the characteristics of a living organism? Now, I'm hopeful that you do remember some of this from biology whenever you took it earlier. But if you're totally lost and you don't know what I'm talking about, well, that's okay. You can pause right now, write all of this down. We're going to talk about it a little bit more, but these are the requirements for considering an organism alive. So number one, nutrition. This is obtaining food for energy and materials for growth. This can happen in different ways, right? I know that you're a human, and the way that humans obtain food is through eating, right? Maybe you go to the grocery store, you buy a bag of chips, and you eat them, and that's how you get your energy. You can also cook food, right? We have evolved to be quite handy in the kitchen, some of us. But there are other organisms that don't do any of that, like plants. They can obtain their energy from the sun. They take in the sunlight, go through photosynthesis. They don't need to eat anything to obtain that energy. Now, growth, this is an irreversible increase in size. I am not the same size that I was when I was 3 years old. I have grown. I have gotten taller. You see this in plants. You see this in other animals, going from like a cub to a full-grown bear. That's an irreversible increase in size. Response, this is sensitivity to or a reaction to changes in the environment. If you were to shine a really bright light in my eye, my pupils would constrict, right? I would squint. I don't like that bright light in my eye. But if I was to go into a dark room, my pupils would dilate to allow as much light as possible to enter my eye. So I am responding to a change in the environment. Excretion is getting rid of waste products of metabolism. So as your body goes through all of these chemical changes that is happening in your body, excretion is a must so that you don't have a buildup of waste products. You can see this when you breathe out, you are releasing carbon dioxide, which is a waste product of all of the uses that your muscles go through, right? You are exchanging oxygen for CO2. CO2 is the waste product in that situation. Metabolism, this is a huge word. This is like the biggest umbrella term ever. It is just a term that talks about every single chemical reaction that happens inside the cell or inside the organism. So any chemical reaction that happens in your body falls under the term metabolism. This could be building something, this could be breaking something down, this could be going through whatever that is causing waste products to form. Anything falls under the metabolism kind of big umbrella term. Homeostasis, this is a big one, massive really. This is going to be talked about from now until probably you graduate high school. Homeostasis. This is keeping internal conditions stable with whatever's happening externally from you. So if you go out and it's 95 degrees out, you are going to start sweating because your internal conditions need to maintain stability, even though it's so hot out. But if you go outside and it's, I don't know, 30 degrees out, you're going to start shivering because you need to maintain heat within your body because it's so cold outside. You're trying to keep your internal conditions stable. So you don't want it to get too cold or too hot, or your blood sugar level, you don't want it to get too out of whack from what is your stable condition. And then finally, reproduction. This is just producing offspring. The offspring should be viable, meaning that those offspring could also have offspring. This can happen sexually or asexually. Of course, that doesn't always happen, right? Like a donkey and a horse can produce offspring, which is a mule, but the mule cannot produce a viable offspring. So it doesn't always happen, but that is like the goal, biologically, the goal of almost all organisms is just to reproduce. Okay, so basic functions of life, we're going to be revisiting all of these throughout the entire course, so we will talk more about this for sure. Now, what about viruses? We've talked about, I've given you some examples of like humans and plants and other animals that have all of these characteristics of life, but what about viruses? Well, first off, what is a virus? Well, they're just particles composed of a protein coat and nucleic acid. So yeah, they have a protein coat, yeah, they have DNA, sometimes RNA, but they're kind of just like little machines. They're actually not living. That is a big point, so please underline that, highlight that, write it in a different color. They are not alive. They do not have all of those characteristics of life that we just talked about, so we do not consider them a living organism. The cell theory. As mentioned in the beginning, we are going to hop around a little bit within this set of notes, so bear with me. We'll talk about each of these a little bit more thoroughly, either in class or in a later set of notes. So just as a general, what is the cell theory? There are 3 parts to it. Number 1, all organisms are composed of 1 or more cells. When I say organisms, I do mean living organisms. They have to be composed of a cell. All living things are made up of a cell, at least 1, can be more than 1. Cells are the smallest units of life, so a unicellular organism is still made up of a cell, 1 singular cell, but it is the smallest unit of life, and all cells come from pre-existing cells. You cannot just like, poof, here's a cell, surprise, here I am. No, that's not how it works. All cells have to come from a previous cell. And who can you thank for coming up with those fabulous cell theory parts? Well, all these dudes. And yeah, unfortunately, they are all male. White men, to be precise. But this is who's getting all of the credit for these particular advances in science. So let's go through them real quick. We have Robert Hooke. He's going to be a big one. You should know he is the first person to view cells under a microscope. He viewed cells in cork. You know what cork is, in the 1600s. That's a long time ago to see a cell. He thought they looked like prison cells, the way that they were all lined up, because they were all like sort of square, like a plant cell. All square cells, just one right after another in this thin piece of cork that he was looking at, and he thought it looked like a prison cell, which is actually where we get the term cell. Following that, we have Anton van Leeuwenhoek. He was the first person to view a living cell. So Robert Hooke viewed cells in the cork, but it was a dead cell. They didn't move. Van Leeuwenhoek viewed living cells about 10 years after Robert Hooke. And then we sort of had a big old break in time until almost 200 years later when we discovered, thanks to Matthias Schleiden, that plants are made of cells. And then right around that same time, Theodor Schwann discovered that animals are made up of cells. So now we figured out, okay, cells look the way they do, and all of these plants around us are made up of cells, and all of these animals around us are made up of cells, which means we're made up of cells. And then a little bit later, but not too, we're still in like the same time frame, around the 1800s, mid to late 1800s. We have Rudolf Virchow, who applied the cell theory that was now a working theory to diseased tissue, and he came up with that 3rd piece of the cell theory to determine that all cells come from pre-existing cells. He was watching the diseased tissue replicate and divide, and he was able to determine that. And then Louis Pasteur kind of built off of that and showed that microorganisms do not spontaneously appear, again, reinforcing the idea that cells have to come from a pre-existing cell. Now, again, hop in a little bit. We are going to practice this, but calculating magnification of an image. The way that we do this is we look at the magnification, and that magnification is equal to the size of the image divided by the size of the specimen. So M equals I over A, magnification equals image over actual size. Okay, so you find the image size by measuring an obvious length of the drawing in millimeters. You will have a ruler to do this. You obtain the same length measurement of the actual specimen. Sometimes this is given to you. It might be in the question or something. You might have to work backwards by figuring out the size of the image. You can rework that formula to kind of fit however you need to. And then if the units are different, you convert them, and then you just use the formula to calculate the unknown. So again, you will be given something. You have your kind of scale bar here so that you can figure out like how you're actually measuring things. You'll notice that this is 1 micrometer, but this same size scale bar is, in this image, is 2 micrometers. So you just have to be thoughtful of what is given to you. Scale bars are used to indicate the actual size of the specimen. So if you were looking for like diameter here, you would measure this scale bar and then measure across the actual specimen to see exactly how many micrometers it is. And the scale bar will always have a measurement associated with it. So, hopping a little bit, but still kind of in the same genre here, surface area versus volume of cells. So, really, really important on how cells work and why cells divide. So let's give ourselves kind of like a working definition of why we care about this. So the volume of a cell is the rate of metabolism. That is sort of the product of volume. So depending on the volume, the higher it is, the higher the rate of metabolism, which means that you can do more chemical reactions. The higher the volume, you have higher heat production, you have higher waste production, and resource consumption, right? So there's a difference between how much maybe I, as an adult human, need to eat, need to have all these chemical reactions happening, versus a 6-year-old human who is smaller, right? So the volume difference is affecting the rate of metabolism within our bodies. And then surface area is the rate of material exchange. So when we're talking about cells here, the larger the cell, the more surface area that's available to go through material exchange. Cells need to exchange heat, waste, resources, right? The more surface area, the more ability, or the higher the ability to go through diffusion, to go through material exchange. So as cells grow, the volume increases faster than the surface area, right? As you have a larger, let's say like a balloon, as you blow up the balloon, the inside grows way faster than the amount of surface area available. So the surface area to volume ratio decreases as the cell grows, okay, because the volume increases faster. So to maintain an ideal surface area to volume ratio, that's why cells divide. Because if a cell gets too big, then it's kind of useless. You're not moving as quickly as you need to, because the higher the volume, the more waste you're producing, but the higher the volume, the lower the surface area in comparison, and so you're not able to kind of diffuse that waste and get all those resources in and out as quickly. So it's not great, which is why cells divide, to keep that ratio lower, so that the cells can continue to survive. There are specialized cells for material exchange, like alveoli, which are found in the lungs. That's how we exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. So some cells are specialized for this, which means that they have an optimum, a best surface area to volume ratio to optimize the transfer of materials. Okay, and the last thing we're going to talk about is emergent properties. These are cool. I am a big fan of this topic of emergent properties. This is sort of saying the sum of our parts is better than the individual parts in a way. So this first slide about this is sort of just kind of discussing what it is. So multicellular organisms are capable of completing functions that individual cells could not undertake. Okay, so again, this is talking about when you put everything together, the sum of our parts has different properties than the individual pieces that make that up. Okay, so the interactions that happen between these individual parts when they become a full cell or even a larger organism create new functions. So at each level, new properties and rules emerge that cannot be predicted by observations and knowledge of the lower levels. So right here, our individual parts, we might know all of the individual functions of cell organelles. We might know, that a nucleus has DNA in it, that the mitochondria produces energy. We might know all of that. But when we put all of those organelles together into one cell, and we have this structure now, well, now they're working together. Now they're kind of bouncing off of each other, and they're creating all these new functions that we didn't know existed just by looking at the individual piece. But now that it's an actual cell and we've put them together, and now we're kind of building off of that, we can see these new properties emerge that are giving us more information about how life works. So as an example, right, we know bacteria is alive. So looking at just a bacteria cell, great, it's alive, we know this, it's hitting all of the characteristics of life, cool. But if you separate out the macromolecules that combined to create the bacteria, those aren't alive, right? Proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, just looking at a specific carb or lipid or protein, that's not a living unit. So, based on our knowledge of macromolecules, right, proteins, nucleic acids, carbs, and lipids, based on that knowledge only, we would have never been able to predict that they could combine to form a living organism. And we also couldn't have predicted all the characteristics that resulted from putting all that together to create the bacteria. It's crazy. So, emergent properties is showing how things that we wouldn't even maybe look twice at years ago, when you put them all together in the specific way, something magical happens. So, for our last slide, I'm just going to talk about this specific level of emergent properties. So, when we are looking at this particular cell, the characteristics of life will emerge at the biological level of cells, okay? But when we start to put all of those cells together, okay, now we're making a heart tissue. And so now, when these are all together, now we can have synchronized contractions because these cardiac cells are working together. And synchronized contractions is what makes your heart beat, right? But then when we put all of those tissues together, okay, well now we've made the organ of the heart, and now a new property is emerging, and now we can pump blood through the body because now we have all these tissues working together to contract and release at the same time so that we can pump blood consistently through the body. Okay, well now we've got that happening, so now we're going to look at the cardiovascular system because again, we're putting all of that together. We're building on each level. And so now when we're looking at the cardiovascular system, now we can transport blood throughout the whole body. Well, that's great, but is that helpful? Hopefully you know the answer to that is yes. And once we are able to pump blood through the whole body, we've now interconnected the functions of the entire body to survive and reproduce, right? Giving oxygen to our muscles is vital for survival. Well, we wouldn't have been able to bring oxygen around unless blood was able to be transported throughout the whole body. Well, we can't transport blood without being able to pump blood. We can't pump blood without being able to contract the heart, and we can't contract the heart without the individual cells. So together we have this crazy property that is only able to happen because we've seen how the individual pieces build to create a new property. Great job. I'm proud of you for making it through your first set of notes, and I'll see you next time.